د قطر په دوحه کې د افغانستان په تړاو د ملګرو ملتونو لخوا یوه غټه غونډه جوړه شوې وه چې له 100 زیاتو هیوادونو استازو پکې ګډون درلود. د یو غونډې ته د افغانستان اسلامي امارت استازي نور بلل شوي او غونډه هم د بند دروازو تر شا وه. د دې ترڅنګ له افغانستان څخه یو ځل بیا د ترهګریزو او امنیتي ګواښونو خبره ګرمه شوې ده او د سیمې هیوادونه او نړیوال هیوادونه پرې خبرې کوي چې له افغانستانه ګواښ نورو هیوادونو ته ګواښ پېښېږي او د رسمي پېژندنې موضوع چې تر اوسه نه ده حل شوې دا چې ولې د دوحې خبرې د بند دروازو تر شا وې د افغانستان اسلامي امارت استازي ولې پکې نه وو؟ آیا واقعا له افغانستان نورو هیوادونو ته ګواښ شته؟ په دې او نورو اړوندو مسایلو نن زه نجیب لالزوی افغانستان لپاره د روبیټل له استازي ښاغلي توماس نیکلسن سره مرکه لرم. سلام، ستړي مه شئ. Mr. Niklasson, thank you very much and welcome back to Kabul.
Thank you for having me and happy Europe Day, 9th of May.
Thank you, happy Europe Day for you. We'll begin with Doha, Mr. Niklasson, because it was quite big actually achievement for the international community in terms of discussing about Afghanistan and getting and convening more than 20 countries and organizations on a single table and talking. But the thing is, it was behind the doors. What was really discussed, if you could please tell us in the audience and to the rest of Afghans?
It was a meeting convened and chaired by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. And you know, any meeting behind closed doors, you start speculating. And there were so much discussions before. Is this a meeting where the Taliban will be recognized? Is it a final declaration of some kind? That was not at all the intention. And I think the idea to have it behind closed doors was precisely to be able for these countries and the European Union and the OIC were also invited to sit around the table and say where do we stand with Afghanistan? How do we see developments? What can we do more in terms of supporting? What are the concerns we have? How should we position ourselves? Do we have similar concerns? And sometimes it's useful to have those discussions without Afghans or others in the room. I found it was a useful discussion. Many of the way we see Afghanistan, the way we see the challenges is very, very similar. I don't want to gloss over differences. There are differences. But overall, everybody is concerned about security. In other words, want to see Afghanistan not to again become a threat to neighbors or other countries. Everybody was calling for a more inclusive or participatory governance system in Afghanistan for dialogue among Afghans. There was a lot of discussion about counter-narcotics, there was a lot of discussion about migration, and there was obviously a lot of discussion about human rights. No one in the room suggested that this was a time to recognize the de facto authorities, but everybody agreed that we also need to continue our engagement, not only with the Taliban, with the de facto authorities, but also with other Afghans.
Shortly, can you please tell me why everyone was not suggesting that this is not the time for recognition?
I think the reasons may vary, but many of the concerns I mentioned were our reasons for countries not to recognize. They are not yet convinced that Afghanistan does not prevent. They're not yet convinced that Afghanistan is fully able to prevent terrorist attacks against other countries. They do not see the de facto authorities respecting human rights fully, and the ban on Afghan women for working for the United Nations is the most recent and very, very blatant example. And I think most of all, they and we think that the order between domestic recognition, legitimacy, acceptance by most people of the government, and international recognition, that's the way we should go. So I think the way to international recognition go through domestic recognition.
Okay, I will come to these specific issues you mentioned about security and the humanitarian and human rights later. But to remain with this specific meeting in Doha, there was no representative from the de facto authorities from the Afghan current government in that meeting. Do you not think that it was important for at least one of the representatives to talk on behalf of the country and the government in that meeting?
I think most of us around the table have frequent opportunities or less frequent opportunities to speak to the de facto authorities. some of us in Kabul, some of us elsewhere. And all the immediate neighbors and Russia had recently met also with Mr. Motaki in Samarkand. So I think we're well aware of the positions of the de facto authorities. As I said, sometimes the principle is, of course, that if we talk about a country or with a country, there should be a broad representation. But sometimes it is also useful to talk among ourselves, and I think we had very good input in formal previous meetings and discussions.
Mm-hmm. Last year, when your deputy was here, Mr. Arnold Pauls, I discussed with him the recognition, and he said that the recognition is not a priority now for us because he quoted, I quote him, he said that there is a humanitarian crisis going on in Afghanistan. The priority should be the people of Afghanistan, delivering aid and assistance to them, and securing, saving them from their death and poverty. Don't you think that recognition really can positively impact the situation of Afghan people, not only economically and financially, but when it comes to other daily life things, indeed?
I think in the medium to long-term recognition is a good thing because it signifies that the international community accepts the government as, as a recognized part of the international community. And that opens up for a type of relations that we cannot really have now. But on the other hand, that recognition is a result of something. Recognition should be the result, as I mentioned, of domestic legitimacy, but also of a certain level of trust and understanding between the international community or the individual member states and the country or the government. So if that trust isn't there, if the relations haven't developed, recognition in itself will not bring a lot of results. There are countries in the world that are recognized, but they do not get support. There is very little political interaction. So it doesn't in itself generate a lot of advantages. So again, I think the right thing to do, and I very much agree, focus, of course, on the humanitarian needs, continue to develop dialogue and trust, make sure, and that is the task of the interim government, to bring other Afghans on board, and then at one point, international recognition, I'm sure, will follow.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I have to stick with one more question in this regard, Mr. Niklasson. It has been more than 1.5 years since the current government came to power, and have you seen at least a setback from them when it comes to their policies that you think are harming or making making their way difficult for the recognition? Is there any flexibility you see? Is there hope you see that? I know that you have the 5 principles for the recognition. At least one of them, has it been fulfilled? Do you feel it that it will be fulfilled in a coming future, or they will get back from their harsh policies so that you can get lenient and recognize them or have formal engagement with them?
I think one of the 5 benchmarks, as we say in Foreign Affairs Council conclusions, and they were recently renewed on the 20th of March since my last visit. EU foreign ministers confirmed that these 5 benchmarks or principles are important to us. They were also, by the way, basically reflected in a UN Security Council resolution adopted just 2 weeks ago. I think we have seen overall relatively good progress on one of them, which is safe passage, meaning Afghans being able to leave the country and to come back to the country. We saw initially also quite good performance, if I use that term, I don't like it, but good progress on humanitarian access. But that again has been challenged by decisions taken by banning Afghan women from working for international organizations. On inclusivity, we see very little progress, although I must say many Afghans, but most Afghans I speak to here, non-Taliban Afghans, show a willingness and an interest in having a dialogue. They don't necessarily call for power sharing, but they would like to have a voice, they would like to be listened to. I think it is fair to say also that there is progress, but I'm not an expert in the field on security. But compared to when I was here in March and also when I was here in October last year, I think at least the number of attacks claimed by Daesh, by ISIS-KP, has gone down. I sense, and more importantly, Afghans tell me that there is more of security in the streets of Kabul than some time ago. So I think there's partial progress. Yeah. The big, dark part in the room is human rights, where I see in many areas, including the rights of women and girls, that unfortunately it is rather a step backwards than forwards. So it's a mixed bag, but there are signs of progress as well.
Okay, thank you.
بیرته راګرځو موږ سره پاتې شئ.
The acting foreign minister, Mr. Muttaqi, went to Pakistan. How important do you think are these visits to regional countries and participating in regional conferences? How important are these visits by an Afghan authority?
As a believer in dialogue, I think they're very important. There are restrictions, and we have some of us can come to Kabul, some of us can invite Mr. Muttaqi and others cannot, but I think it's important to meet. And I think it's extremely important to develop good relations with all the neighbors of Afghanistan. And that, I think, was a positive signal also in Doha. I see more of the region and the immediate neighbors coming together, rather than, as we have seen in the past, having too strong conflicting interest in Afghanistan. I see them having very similar interest, and I think that can provide the space needed for Afghanistan to develop.
You're representing Afghanistan for the European Union, Mr. Niklasson. Will you lobby for such visits of Afghan authorities to regional or beyond the region?
I will lobby for, and I hope I get the budget for, continuing to visit, and I hope it will continue to be received. I think, and that was also discussed in Doha, at a certain moment in time, visits and interaction, bilateral, regional, and perhaps also in the larger group that met in Doha with the acting foreign minister and other Afghans, including Afghan women, will be useful. And I hope that time will come relatively soon, but that depends on the actions, not only by the international community, but also, and perhaps primarily, by the de facto authorities.
Mm-hmm. Coming to security, which is probably the biggest concern of the international community when it comes to Afghanistan, do you really think that Afghanistan is a threat to the region and beyond?
I listened carefully to the statements made by the neighboring countries when we met in Doha.
And also statements made by the Afghan government that they say, no, it is not. The people cannot prove it. They cannot come with the proof. Just yesterday, Amir Khan Muttaqi in Islamabad said that no country, no organization can prove that there are terrorist presence in Afghanistan. So there is actually a conflict of ideas in this regard.
There may be a conflict of ideas. I think there's a genuine commitment by the Afghan de facto authorities to fight Daesh. I think there's a shortage of resources in some areas and concerning some of the organizations. But this is an area which is so close to the national interest of all the neighboring countries that it will be in the interest of Afghanistan that it's simply not enough to say they cannot prove that there is a threat, because as long as that threat perception is there, it will block progress in other areas.
ډېره مننه کوم ځانګړې مرکه همدومره وه. تر بیا ښه وخت.
له لیدلو مو مننه.